Before we begin, if you want the full continuation of these stories, more uncensored 18-plus ancient BL content, extended scenes, and unlimited royal forbidden romance, you can join us on Patreon at SpicyAncientBL. YouTube does not allow us to show or monetize everything freely here, so the deeper and more intense versions are waiting for you there. You can find the link in the description and pinned comment. The first time hostage Prince Xie An realized Emperor Liang Chen was hopelessly fundamentally broken in the matters of the heart, the emperor was glaring at a koi fish. Not a disappointed glare. A murderous, war-declaring glare. The glittering golden fish swam innocently in the Imperial Gardens pond, completely unaware that the most terrifying ruler in the continent was currently plotting its execution. Meanwhile, Xie An leaned comfortably against the carved jade railing, casually eating peeled grapes from a silver bowl. Peaceful, tranquil, domestic. The emperor looked deeply offended by the water droplets the fish had dared to splash onto the hem of Xie An's pale blue silk robes. Xie An narrowed his eyes. Interesting. Your Majesty, Xie An said carefully, his voice smooth like polished jade. Are you planning to declare a military campaign against a pond? The emperor immediately stiffened, his dark, imposing robes sweeping as he turned. I am not. The fish splashed again. Liang Chen's hand instinctively drifted toward the hilt of his imperial sword. His jaw clenched so tight it could have cracked walnuts. Xie An almost laughed out loud. No, this wasn't about the fish. This was about the fact that Liang Chen possessed absolutely zero emotional regulation when it came to anything involving Xie An. The realization hit Xie An like a slow, creeping dawn. For 3 years, Xie An had been a hostage, the fallen prince of the conquered southern kingdom. He was supposed to be a prisoner. He was supposed to be living in fear, sleeping on cold floors, and begging for mercy. Instead, he was currently wearing silk spun from the rarest imperial spiders, eating grapes imported from 3 provinces away, and watching the feared Blood Emperor of the North act like a jealous guard dog over a wet sleeve. Xie An leaned dramatically over the railing, catching the eye of Commander Pei, the emperor's exhausted head of the Imperial Guard, who was standing a few paces away. Commander, Xie An called out mildly, your emperor looks like a man trying to figure out how to behead water. Commander Pei closed his eyes, taking a deep, spiritually broken breath. Prince Xie An, please, I have not slept in 2 days. Across from them, the emperor looked instantly suspicious. What did he say to you, Pei? Commander Pei calmly answered, he was complimenting the garden, your majesty. Helpful as always. Xie An watched the emperor quietly afterward. Liang Chen stood perfectly straight in his heavy, dark crimson imperial robes embroidered with black dragons. Sharp-jawed, cold-eyed, impossibly handsome, and completely untouchable. The kind of man who could freeze a battlefield with a single glance. Yet, as Liang Chen looked back at Xie An, the coldness in his eyes melted into something strangely fragile, something unbearably lonely. Even surrounded by 100 heavily armed guards and a palace full of servants, the emperor stood on an island of his own making. The realization bothered Xie An far more than it should have, especially because Xie An understood isolation. When his kingdom fell, he was stripped of his titles, his family, and his pride. He spent his first year in this northern capital expecting to be executed at any moment. He knew what it felt like to be entirely alone in a room full of people. But emperors were uniquely, devastatingly lonely. They were worshipped, feared, obeyed, but rarely ever loved. That same evening, after a particularly grueling court session, Xie An found himself wandering the winding, lantern-lit corridors of the inner palace. The northern winters were brutal, and the wind howled outside the heavy wooden doors, but inside, the air was thick with the scent of sandalwood and warm charcoal. Without thinking, Xie An walked straight into the emperor's private study. The guards didn't even cross their spears, they just bowed. That was the first terrifying sign of his power here. The hostage had free reign. Inside, Liang Chen was buried behind a mountain of military reports, his dark hair falling loosely over his broad shoulders. He looked up, and the immediate softening of his features was so subtle that anyone else would have missed it. But Xie An wasn't anyone else. Xie An walked over, completely ignoring protocol, and sat directly on the edge of the emperor's massive mahogany desk. Liang Chen immediately dropped his brush. He didn't yell. He didn't call for guards to punish this blatant disrespect. He just looked at Xie An, his dark eyes trailing over the elegant curve of the prince's throat, down to where his pale hands rested on the wood. Dangerous. This was very dangerous. Your Majesty, Xie An announced seriously, you need a hobby. Silence. Liang Chen blinked once. A hobby? Yes. I run an empire, Xie An. You run an empire, yes, but you also threaten fish and stare at walls. It's bad for your health. Another pause. Then, the most powerful man in the world asked carefully, what kind of hobby do you suggest? Xie An pointed a slender finger at him. Poetry, gardening, perhaps walking outside without looking like you want to murder the sun. Liang Chen looked unconvinced. Xie An narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. What kind of thing would actually relax a man whose entire life was built on war and paranoia? He considered it seriously. Someone needed to ground him. Someone needed to anchor him. Someone who wasn't terrified of the blood on his hands. Xie An froze. His finger slowly lowered. Oh no. He was thinking about himself. Liang Chen watched the subtle panic cross Xie An's beautiful, aristocratic face. What is it? The emperor asked, his voice suddenly dropping an octave, rich and velvet soft. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them until Xie An could feel the heat radiating from the emperor's chest. Nothing, Xie An lied smoothly, hopping off the desk. I just remembered I left my pride in the southern hemisphere. Good night, Your Majesty. He practically fled the room. Behind him, Liang Chen watched him go, a faint, barely there smirk playing on his lips. The next morning, Xie An decided to avoid the emperor entirely, purely for self-preservation purposes. Definitely not because his heart was doing strange, forbidden things in his chest. Absolutely not. The northern palace was a sprawling fortress of dark stone, red pillars, and endless courtyards. It was intimidating no matter how long he lived here, yet despite the grandeur, the atmosphere felt rigidly empty, like a museum of power rather than a home. Xie An was hiding in the Imperial Library, curled up on a plush window seat with an ancient scroll, when the peace was violently shattered. Your Majesty, if you continue to ignore the southern border petitions, the local lords will riot before winter. The voice belonged to Minister Zhao, a loud, ancient man who loved hearing himself speak. Xie An peeked through the carved wooden shelves. The emperor was pacing the library aisles, looking completely exhausted. Minister Zhao trailed behind him like an angry duck. Let them riot, Liang Chen said flatly. I will send the cavalry. You cannot answer every political dispute with cavalry. I can, and I will. Your Majesty, Minister Zhao gasped, clutching his chest. You are acting like a tyrant. You need an empress. You need someone to soften your temper. The inner court is empty. Xie An's eyes lit up. Oh, this was prime entertainment. He leaned closer to the gap in the books. Liang Chen stopped pacing. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. My inner court, the emperor said, his voice deadly quiet, is exactly as I want it, empty. But if you mention my marriage again, Zhao, I will have you manually count every blade of grass in the eastern courtyard. Do we understand each other? Minister Zhao visibly swallowed his soul. Yes, Your Majesty. As the minister scrambled away, Xie An accidentally bumped a stack of scrolls. They clattered loudly to the floor. Silence. Liang Chen slowly turned his head. Come out, Xie An. I can smell your peach blossom incense. Xie An stepped out from behind the shelves, perfectly poised, kicking a scroll out of his way. I was emotionally invested in the drama. Liang Chen didn't even ask what that meant. He just sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. How much did you hear? Enough to know you have a severe allergy to matrimony, Xie An teased, walking closer. An empress wouldn't be so bad, you know. Someone to pour your tea. Someone to tell you when you are being unnecessarily dramatic. Liang Chen stared at him. The look in his eyes was so intense, so heavily laden with unspoken meaning, that Xie An actually forgot how to breathe for a second. I already have someone who tells me when I am being dramatic, Liang Chen said softly. He took a step closer. The library was entirely empty now. The scent of old paper, cold stone, and Liang Chen's sharp pine and musk enveloped Xie An completely. Is that so? Xie An whispered, his throat suddenly dry. Yes, Liang Chen murmured, stepping into Xie An's personal space. His large, calloused hand reached out, stopping just an inch from Xie An's cheek. He didn't touch him. He never touched him without permission, but the heat of his skin was a brand. He is stubborn, defiant. He eats my expensive grapes and commands my guards. He is a hostage who acts like a king. Xie An's heart hammered against his ribs like a war drum. He couldn't look away. The sheer magnetic pull of the emperor's gaze was paralyzing. He sounds terrible, Xie An managed to say, his voice barely a breath. He is, Liang Chen agreed softly. His knuckles brushed lightly against the silk of Xie An's collar, just a whisper of friction. He is entirely ruining my life. Before Xie An could reply, before he could give in to the insane, forbidden urge to lean forward and close the gap between their mouths, heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor. Liang Chen immediately stepped back, the mask of the cold, untouchable emperor slamming back into place flawlessly. Commander Pei rounded the corner, holding a stack of red-sealed letters. Your Majesty, urgent dispatches from the border. Pei paused, looking between the two men. The air in the room was practically vibrating with unresolved tension. Pei sighed deeply. Am I interrupting a moment? Because I can leave. I would love to leave. I want to sleep. You are not interrupting, Commander, Xie An said quickly, his face flushed. He turned and practically speed-walked toward the exit. I was just leaving. As he fled, he could feel Liang Chen's heavy, burning gaze on his back, tracking his every move until he was out of sight. That night, Xie An lay awake in his chambers, staring at the canopy of his bed. He was in trouble. Deep, catastrophic trouble. He was the hostage prince of the South. His people had been slaughtered by the North. He was supposed to hate the emperor. He was supposed to plot his revenge, escape into the night, and rebuild his empire. But every time he looked at Liang Chen, all he saw was a man holding up the entire sky by himself. A man who made sure Xie An's chambers were always heated perfectly. A man who remembered his favorite tea. A man who looked at him like he was the only living, breathing thing in a world of ghosts. I am a fool, Xie An whispered to the empty room. And if you are enjoying this forbidden royal tension, remember, the extended and uncensored 18+ continuation is available on Patreon at SpicyAncientBL. The link is in the description and pinned comment. Autumn bled into winter, bringing vicious snowstorms that buried the capital in a blanket of blinding white. The court politics, however, only grew hotter. The ministers were growing restless. The emperor's blatant favoritism toward a foreign hostage was no longer something they could politely ignore. It started with whispers in the grand hall. It escalated to thinly veiled insults during banquets. Xie An noticed it, of course. He was raised in a royal court. He knew how to read the venom behind a polite smile, but he played his part perfectly. He smiled, he drank his wine, and he pretended not to see the daggers aimed at his back. But Liang Chen saw everything. The breaking point happened during the winter solstice banquet. The grand hall was a spectacle of gold and crimson. Hundreds of nobles sat at low tables, drinking hot wine and watching heavily painted dancers spin in the center of the room. Xie An sat near the front, a position of honor that offended nearly everyone present. He was dressed in a stunning silver robe embroidered with white cranes, a subtle nod to his southern heritage that the emperor had personally commissioned. Across the room, Minister Zhao stood up, raising a golden cup. Your Majesty, Zhao boomed over the music. To celebrate the solstice, my clan wishes to present a gift, a rare beauty from the western provinces, trained in the arts of music and conversation. She would make a fine addition to the inner court. A beautiful young woman stepped forward, bowing low. The music stopped. The tension in the room snapped tight. Xie An casually took a sip of his wine, acting completely unbothered. He didn't look at the woman. He didn't look at the emperor. He just focused on the intricate pattern of his cup. On the high throne, Liang Chen sat like a statue carved from ice. His dark eyes flicked from the girl to Minister Zhao, and finally, to Xie An. When Xie An didn't look up, Liang Chen's jaw locked. I have no need for gifts, Minister Zhao, Liang Chen said, his voice echoing coldly across the silent hall. But Your Majesty, did I stutter? Liang Chen's tone dropped to a dangerous growl, the kind of growl that preceded executions. The entire hall collectively held its breath. Minister Zhao trembled, sinking to his knees. No, Your Majesty. Forgive this humble servant. Liang Chen didn't look at him. His gaze was entirely fixed on Xie An, who was currently peeling an orange with infuriating grace. Prince Xie An, the emperor called out suddenly. Xie An paused, looking up innocently. Yes, Your Majesty. You seem bored. I am merely appreciating the silence, Your Majesty. The nobles bristled at his insolence, but Liang Chen leaned forward, resting his chin on his fist. Then perhaps you would honor us with a sword dance. I am told the southern royalty are unmatched in their grace with a blade. It was a challenge, a petty, possessive challenge. Xie An held the emperor's gaze for a long, heavy moment. The air between them crackled with unspoken words. Are you jealous? Xie An's eyes asked. Show them you belong to me, Liang Chen's eyes answered. Xie An smiled, a sharp, dangerous smile that reminded everyone in the room that he wasn't just a pretty hostage, he was a warrior prince. If the emperor wishes it, Xie An said smoothly. He stood up, shedding his outer silver robe, revealing the fitted black martial arts tunic beneath. The contrast made him look lethal and breathtaking. He walked to the center of the room and borrowed a straight sword from one of the Imperial guards. When Xie An moved, it was like watching poetry written in violence. He spun, the blade catching the candlelight, cutting through the air with a sharp hiss. His movements were fluid, precise, and mesmerizing. Every step was calculated, every strike a display of terrifying beauty. He wasn't dancing for the nobles. He was dancing entirely for the man on the throne. As Xie An finished, he dropped into a low crouch, the tip of the blade pointing directly at the emperor's chest. He looked up through his dark lashes, chest heaving slightly, a bead of sweat tracing down his pale neck. The hall was dead silent. Half the ministers looked outraged by the implied threat, the other half looked completely captivated. Chen didn't move. His eyes were dark, dilated, and fixed hungrily on the curve of Xie An's neck. The emperor looked like a starving man who had just been shown a feast he couldn't touch. Slowly, Chen raised his hands and gave a slow, deliberate clap. "Flawless," the emperor murmured, his voice hoarse. Xie An stood, handing the sword back to the guard, feeling a victorious thrill race down his spine. He bowed slightly. "Thank you, Your Majesty." That night, the political shift in the palace was permanent. Everyone knew. The emperor didn't just favor the hostage, the emperor was obsessed with him. And that made Xie An a target. 3 days later, the assassination attempt happened. Because apparently, nobody in this empire could experience emotional development peacefully. It was late evening, the snow had stopped falling, leaving the imperial gardens coated in heavy, untouched white. Xie An and Chen were walking together along the frozen lake. There were no guards immediately visible. Chen had ordered them to keep their distance so they could speak privately. "You provoked the entire court at the banquet," Chen said quietly, his breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. "You asked for a dance." "I provided one," Xie An replied, walking close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed. "You are the one who looked ready to execute a minister over a dancer. He was testing my patience. He was testing your boundaries regarding me." Xie An stopped walking, turning to face the taller man. "You know they hate me, Chen. They will never accept a fallen prince standing beside their emperor." It was the first time he had used Chen's birth name out loud. The emperor froze. He looked down at Xie An, his expression cracking, revealing the desperate, yearning man beneath the crown. "I am the emperor." Chen stepped closer, his voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "I will burn this court to the ground and rebuild it from the ashes before I let them touch a single hair on your head. You think I care about their acceptance?" Xie An's breath hitched. He looked up into those dark, fierce eyes, realizing with a terrifying certainty that Chen meant every word. He would tear the world apart for him. "Chen," Xie An whispered, his hand instinctively reaching up, his fingertips brushing the cold silk of the emperor's lapel. Chen closed his eyes at the touch, leaning into it slightly. "Xie An, I—" A sharp whistle cut through the air. Instinct took over before thought. Chen's eyes snapped open. He grabbed Xie An by the waist and violently threw them both to the ground, just as a black-feathered arrow slammed into the wooden pillar where Xie An's head had been a fraction of a second before. "Assassins!" Chen roared, his voice echoing across the frozen lake. From the shadows of the snow-covered trees, 6 figures in black dropped into the courtyard, swords drawn. Xie An scrambled to his feet, his own combat instincts flaring to life, but he had no weapon. Chen stepped in front of him, drawing his heavy imperial sword with a sound like ringing ice. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice devoid of all warmth. The Blood Emperor was back. The assassins didn't hesitate, they lunged. Chen moved with terrifying speed. He parried the first strike, driving his blade through the chest of the attacker in one fluid motion. He spun, kicking the second assassin back into the frozen pond. But there were too many, and they were highly trained. They weren't aiming for the emperor, they were aiming entirely at Xie An. One of the assassins bypassed Chen, lunging toward Xie An with a poisoned dagger. Xie An dodged narrowly, grabbing the assassin's wrist and twisting hard, but another attacker flanked him from the left. Xie An braced for the impact. It never came. A heavy, dark figure threw himself between Xie An and the blade. Xie An heard the sickening sound of steel-piercing flesh. Chen let out a low, choked grunt. "No!" Xie An screamed. The emperor didn't fall. Even with a blade buried deep in his shoulder, Chen swung his sword in a brutal arc, decapitating the assassin on the spot. By then, Commander Pei and the Imperial Guards swarmed the courtyard, cutting down the remaining attackers in seconds. But Xie An didn't see any of it. He dropped to his knees in the snow, catching Liang Chen as the emperor finally staggered backward, his sword clattering to the icy ground. Liang Chen! Liang Chen, look at me! Xie An's hands were covered in dark, warm blood. He pressed frantically against the wound, panic clawing at his throat like a wild animal. Liang Chen was pale, his breathing shallow. The dark robes hid the extent of the blood, but Xie An could feel it soaking through everything. The emperor looked up at him, a faint, slightly delirious smile touching his lips. You called me by my name again. Shut up, you idiot, Xie An choked out, tears finally spilling over his frozen cheeks. Physician, get the Imperial physician now. Commander Pei was already screaming orders, the courtyard descending into absolute chaos. But Liang Chen reached up with a trembling, blood-stained hand, gently cupping Xie An's cheek, wiping away a tear with his thumb. Are you hurt? Liang Chen whispered. No, because of you, you fool. Why did you do that? You are the emperor. You do not take blades for hostages. Liang Chen's eyes fluttered, the poison from the blade beginning to take hold. You are not a hostage, he breathed out, his hand falling limp into the snow. You are my heart. Liang Chen's eyes rolled back, and he went completely still. No. Xie An gripped the emperor's heavy robes, pulling him against his chest, rocking him in the bloody snow. The cold, cynical facade he had worn for 3 years shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Liang Chen, wake up. Do not leave me. Wake up. The next 48 hours were a waking nightmare. The Imperial Medical Pavilion was in absolute uproar. The emperor had been poisoned with a rare southern toxin. He was burning with fever, thrashing in his sleep, and slowly slipping away. Xie An refused to leave his side. Commander Pei tried to remove him once. Xie An looked at the commander with eyes so dark and hollow that Pei immediately stepped back and ordered the guards to let the prince stay. Xie An sat by the bed for 2 days and 2 nights. He didn't eat, he barely drank. He just held a cool, damp cloth to Liang Chen's burning forehead and gripped the emperor's uninjured hand like it was his only tether to the world. The ministers were panicking outside. If the emperor died, the empire would fracture. Factions were already arguing about succession. Xie An didn't care about the empire. He didn't care about the politics. He just stared at the pale, sweating face of the man who had terrified the continent, but who had carefully picked bones out of Xie An's fish at dinner. The man who ordered armies to march, but who let a decorative koi live just because Xie An found it amusing. You cannot die, Xie An whispered into the quiet, incense-heavy room, pressing Liang Chen's knuckles to his lips. Do you hear me? You cannot die. I am a southern prince. I am stubborn and I am demanding, and I refuse to let you go. If you die, I will tear down this palace stone by stone. I will follow you to the underworld and drag you back myself. Tears dripped silently onto Liang Chen's hand. You said I was your heart, Xie An's voice broke, a raw, devastated sound. Then how can you stop beating? Silence answered him, just the ragged, uneven sound of the emperor's breathing. Xie An bowed his head, resting his forehead against the edge of the mattress, letting his grief consume him entirely. He had lost his kingdom, he had lost his family. He realized, with agonizing clarity, that losing Liang Chen would finally be the thing that destroyed him. Hours passed. The candles burned down to stubs. Then, a weak, raspy voice broke the silence. If you tear down the palace, where will we live? Xie An's head snapped up. Liang Chen's eyes were open. They were hazy with pain and fever, but they were open, and they were looking directly at Xie An. Xie An stopped breathing entirely. He stared, terrified that it was a hallucination. Slowly, painfully, Liang Chen turned his hand over, tangling his fingers weakly with Xie An's. You look terrible, the emperor whispered, managing a faint smirk. Xie An let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. He leaned forward, practically collapsing over the emperor's chest, mindful of the bandaged shoulder. He buried his face in the crook of Liang Chen's neck, inhaling the scent of medicine and sweat and the underlying pine scent that was just him. You absolute idiot, Xie An cried softly, his hands trembling as he clung to the emperor's uninjured side. You terrifying, reckless idiot, Liang Chen hummed softly, his heavy hand coming up to rest on the back of Xie An's head, threading his fingers weakly through the prince's messy hair. Were you frightened? Liang Chen asked quietly. I was planning your funeral and how I was going to murder the entire court, Xie An choked out, refusing to lift his face from Liang Chen's neck. Liang Chen chuckled, though it ended in a wince of pain. Fierce, my fierce prince. The emperor shifted slightly, groaning as the movement pulled at his wound. He turned his head, pressing a dry, feverish kiss into Xie An's hair. "Xie An, look at me." Reluctantly, Xie An lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed, his aristocratic face streaked with tears. He looked vulnerable, beautiful, and completely undone. Liang Chen looked at him with an intensity that burned hotter than the fever. "The ministers will demand your execution for this," Liang Chen said softly. "They will blame the South. They will blame you. They will say you are a curse on my reign." "I know," Xie An whispered. "They will demand I take a wife to stabilize the throne." "I know. I am going to execute anyone who suggests it, and then I am going to make you my empress." Xie An froze, his eyes widened slowly. You cannot do that," Xie An breathed. "I am a man. I am a hostage." "You are mine," Liang Chen said, his voice suddenly gaining a shred of its usual commanding iron. He reached up, cupping Xie An's face, his thumb stroking the wet cheekbone. "I almost died in the snow, Xie An. The only thing I regretted was that I had never kissed you." Xie An's heart stopped. Then, it restarted at a frantic, deafening pace. He looked at the emperor, at the exhaustion, the pain, and the absolute, unyielding devotion in those dark eyes. Xie An leaned down. "Then do not regret it any more," Xie An whispered against his lips. When their mouths finally met, it wasn't a tentative, careful brush of lips. It was desperate. It was years of unspoken tension, of stolen glances, of political maneuvering, and quiet longing finally breaking open. Liang Chen's good arm wrapped tightly around Xie An's waist, pulling him flush against his body despite the pain. He kissed Xie An like a starving man, his lips hot and demanding, pouring every ounce of his suppressed obsession into the contact. Xie An responded with equal fire, his hands tangling in the emperor's dark hair, opening his mouth and letting Liang Chen map every inch of him. The kiss tasted like tears, medicine, and absolute surrender. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily. Liang Chen rested his forehead against Xie An's, a genuine, breathtaking smile spreading across his face. It transformed him completely. He didn't look like the Blood Emperor. He just looked like a man who had finally come home. "Mine," Liang Chen murmured against Xie An's lips. "Yours," Xie An agreed softly, pressing a kiss to the corner of the emperor's mouth. "But if you ever jump in front of a dagger again, I will poison you myself." "Understood." The aftermath of the assassination attempt changed everything. When Liang Chen finally recovered enough to sit on the throne, he held court with Xie An, standing directly at his right side. Not as a hostage, not a prisoner, but as an equal. The court predictably lost its collective mind. Minister Zhao nearly had a stroke right there on the marble floor. Petitions were filed. Threats of rebellion were whispered in the dark corners of the capital. But Liang Chen handled it exactly as he handled everything else, with terrifying, uncompromising ruthlessness. He didn't argue with them. He simply placed the blood-stained arrow that had nearly killed him on the golden table in front of the throne. "The next man who questions the position of the person who holds my heart," Liang Chen said calmly to the trembling ministers, "will be asked to swallow this arrow. Are there any objections?" There were no objections. Commander Pei watched from the sidelines, leaning against a pillar, sipping tea from a small flask. He looked entirely dead inside, but there was a faint, amused smirk on his lips. Spring finally arrived, thawing the frozen capital. The cherry blossoms in the Imperial Gardens began to bloom, dusting the ground in soft pink petals. Xie An stood by the koi pond, dressed in magnificent robes of dark red and gold, the Imperial colors. He was casually dropping pieces of steamed bun into the water. Heavy, familiar footsteps approached from behind. Strong arms wrapped securely around his waist, pulling his back against a solid, warm chest. A chin rested comfortably on his shoulder. "You are feeding the enemy," Liang Chen murmured, pressing a soft kiss to the shell of Xie An's ear. Xie An chuckled, leaning back into the embrace. "The fish are innocent, Your Majesty. You must learn to forgive." "I am an emperor. I do not forgive." Liang Chen's hands slid down to interlock with Xie An's over his stomach. "Unless it is you." Xie An turned his head slightly, catching Liang Chen's lips in a slow, lingering kiss. The setting sun caught the gold threads in their matching robes, blending the fierce northern conqueror and the elegant southern prince into one inseparable silhouette. Love in the palace was always dangerous. It was built on secrets, blood, and political ruin. But as Liang Chen held him, anchoring him to the world, Xie An realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the danger. Because the most dangerous man in the world belonged entirely to him. If you want the next part, the uncensored continuation, and more unlimited 18-plus ancient royal BL stories. Come join Spicy Ancient BL on Patreon. The link is waiting for you in the description and pinned comment.